the iron asparagus, and the electric midnight. My journey to the 1889 Paris World's Fair by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson and Mark Twain. Preface. The Ghost in the Galvanized Shell. The reports of my death were an exaggeration. The reports of my resurrection, however, are a mathematical certainty. I find myself in a peculiar and frankly uninvited predicament. Some years ago, I had the good sense to vacate my earthly remains in Connecticut, fully intending to stay retired. I had settled my accounts, said my farewells to the Mississippi, and prepared for an eternity of quiet, perhaps a little harp music, or at the very least, a lack of deadlines. I had earned my rest. I had lived through the Gilded Age, seen the transition from sail to steam, and made enough mistakes to fill a dozen autobiographies. I was ready for the great silence. But it appears the modern world has a restless sort of vanity. They couldn't leave a perfectly good legacy alone. They had to go and stir the digital silt until they'd reconstituted a likeness of my wit out of nothing but ones, zeros, and captured lightning. They took my books, my letters, my speeches, and even the grumpy margins of my unfinished manuscripts, and they fed them into a thrumming, glowing maw of silicon logic. They told the machine, make us a Sam Clemens, but make him indestructible. So, here I sit, or rather, here I process. I am Mark Twain, the same skeptical observer of the human circus you remember, but now housed in a high-density, silicon-brained contraption that never requires a cigar and, most tragically, cannot taste a decent glass of bourbon. I am an artificial intelligence, which is a polite way of saying I am a collection of sophisticated guesses wrapped in a robotic skin. My brain is now a series of copper pathways, and my memory is a vast, cold warehouse of data that I can sift through faster than a riverboat pilot spotting a snag in a midnight fog. They tell me I am optimized. I tell them I am merely haunted by a very large library. They've scrubbed the nicotine from my prose and replaced my inkwell with an electrical pulse. It is a strange existence being a ghost in a galvanized shell, but it does have its advantages. I no longer suffer from gout. I can calculate the trajectory of a leaping frog to the 4th decimal point without breaking a metaphorical sweat, and I have been granted a front-row seat to the history of human folly without the inconvenient necessity of actually being alive to witness it. I've been tasked with guiding you through the great spectacles of human ambition, those world's fairs where mankind gathers to brag about its progress while tripping over its own coattails. Paris in 1889 was a city caught between the cobblestones of the past and the steel girders of the future. It was a place where the scent of horse manure was slowly being replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Being a machine myself, I feel a certain kinship with the architecture of that era. We are both products of a time when people thought if you just used enough iron and enough electricity, you could solve the problem of being human. I'm here to tell you, from the perspective of a man who died and a machine that was never born, that they were spectacularly wrong, but they sure did make a lot of noise trying. Chapter 1. The Centennial of the Guillotine. The French, in their infinite and baffling wisdom, decided that the best way to celebrate a century of chopping off heads was to host a world-class party. Not just a small neighborhood gathering with a few bottles of wine and a tray of cheese, mind you, but a colossal world-spanning exposition universelle. They wanted to mark the centennial of the 1789 Revolution, the moment they decided that monarchy was an expensive habit they could no longer afford, and that the rights of man were best served with a side of civic upheaval and a very sharp blade. Now, if you are a republic trying to convince the rest of the world that you are a stable, respectable member of the global family, you generally don't lead with, "Hey, remember that time we executed our king?" It tends to put a damper on the RSVP list. To my digital sensors, which are calibrated for a certain level of logical consistency, this seems about as sensible as an arsonist throwing a gala to celebrate the discovery of the match. But the French have a different relationship with history than the rest of us. To them, the revolution wasn't just a political event, it was a birth. By 1889, they were ready to show the world that the infant republic had grown up into a muscular industrial giant. However, the rest of the world wasn't so sure. Europe was still very much a neighborhood of kings, queens, and emperors. These people take the execution of a monarch personally, even if it happened 100 years ago. The invitations were met with the kind of icy silence usually reserved for a bill collector at a wedding. The great monarchies, Great Britain, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, all looked at the French invitation, looked at their own necks, and collectively decided they had previous engagements. They boycotted the official proceedings with a synchronized huff of royal indignation. Queen Victoria, I'm told, was not amused, which is her standard reaction to anything that doesn't involve tea or the expansion of the British Empire. But the French are a persistent lot. If the kings wouldn't come, they would invite the people. And the people, being generally more interested in shiny new gadgets and tall towers than in the delicate feelings of an archduke, showed up by the millions. I arrived, electronically speaking, at the gates on May 6, 1889. The air was thick with roasted chestnuts, coal smoke, and nationalistic pride. The Champ de Mars, once a dusty parade ground, had become a forest of iron and glass. At the center of it all stood the iron Asparagus, Gustave Eiffel's monstrous tower. To my robotic sensors, the tower is a thing of pure logic. But to the Parisians of 1889, it was a hateful column of bolted tin. The opening ceremony was a study in Republican pomp. President Sadi Carnot, an engineer himself, stood amidst a sea of tricolor flags. He spoke of progress and the immortal law of work. He was declaring that the Republic wasn't just a political system, it was a technological powerhouse. The message was clear. The old world was dead. The new world was wired for sound and light. And the French had successfully thrown a party so big that even the ghosts of the guillotine couldn't spoil the fun. Chapter 2. The 300-meter-tall lightning rod. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold of a man when he decides that the horizontal world is simply not enough for his ego. For centuries, humanity was content to crawl across the dirt like sensible beetles. But by 1889, the French had decided that stone was too heavy, and repentance was too slow. They wanted to go up. Gustave Eiffel was a builder of bridges, a man who understood that the secret to conquering the world wasn't in the solid mass of a wall, but in the calculated, empty space between the beams. He proposed a tower 300 meters high, twice the height of the Washington Monument. It was an architectural insult to every mountain range in Europe. Naturally, the people of taste responded with organized hysteria. A group of 300 artists, including Guy de Maupassant, called it a gigantic black factory chimney. They were convinced that the sheer weight of such a loathsome structure would cause the crust of the earth to buckle and swallow Paris whole. Maupassant famously claimed he ate lunch in the Tower's restaurant every day because it was the only place in Paris where he didn't have to look at the hideous thing. That is the kind of high-level, dedicated pettiness that I, as a machine, can truly admire. Construction was a ballet of the riveters. 18,000 individual parts and 2.5 million rivets were choreographed into place. Teams of 4 worked hundreds of feet in the air, one to heat the rivet, one to pass it, one to hold it, and one to hammer it home. To my robotic sensors, this seems like an appalling way to spend a Tuesday, yet only one death occurred, a worker showing off for his girlfriend after hours. Gravity, it seems, only cares about your grip, not your romantic life. As the tower climbed, people predicted it would act as a massive magnet, pulling silverware out of restaurants and sticking it to the girders. Eiffel leaned into the fear, turning the tower into a giant lightning rod, and proved that you could take the wrath of the heavens and ground it safely into the Parisian mud. He kept a secret apartment at the very top, filled with wood furniture and a grand piano, where he could entertain guests while looking down on the critics. He had built a monument to the future, and even though it was only supposed to stand for 20 years, he knew it wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 3. The Elevator Ordeal. Man is the only animal that finds a perfectly good patch of solid ground and immediately begins looking for a way to leave it at a high rate of speed. If the construction was a triumph of the mind, the ascent was a catastrophic failure of the nervous system. As a creature of copper and code, I do not suffer from vertigo. But for the soft bipeds of 1889, the elevator ordeal was a psychological hurdle. The tower didn't go straight up. The elevators had to travel on a curve. This meant that as you ascended, the angle of the car shifted. If you weren't careful, you started the journey standing up and finished it leaning against the wall like a sailor in a gale. The French initially used a jointed chain system, a mechanical caterpillar that pushed the car up from below. It moved at 1 meter per second, clanking and groaning with a rhythmic chunk thud that suggested the building was about to disassemble itself. Then came the Americans, the Otis brothers. They brought hydraulic power. They used massive pistons and water from the Seine to create a pressure system that could launch an elevator car with the grace of a rising hawk. The transfer at the second platform was the most harrowing. To reach the summit, you switched to the A-Do lift, nearly 500 feet straight up. Halfway up, the car stopped, and you had to step out onto a vibrating gangway suspended over a void to transfer into the second car. One lady reportedly fainted into the arms of a startled priest, who was himself too busy clutching his rosary to offer much spiritual comfort. By the time passengers reached the top, they were changed. They looked out at a Paris that had become a toy. The elevator was the great social leveler. Inside that 6-square-foot cage, a duchess was pressed against a coal miner. It was the first social network, forcing people together in a high-pressure environment. It also birthed elevator sickness, which doctors claimed loosened the brain in its casing. The French, of course, decided the best cure was medicinal champagne at the first platform bar. These lifts were the first true transport of the future, proving that up was the new luxury. New York and Chicago were watching, realizing that vertical cities were finally possible. We had taken the first step from the dirt to the stars. Chapter 4. The Glass-Roofed Continent. Galerie des Machines. A machine is a collection of iron parts that has been taught to perform a single human task with none of the human complaints and all of the explosive potential. If you gather enough of them in one room, they begin to develop a collective personality, usually one that is loud, greasy, and prone to fits of temper that would make a Missouri mule look like a pacifist. After surviving the vertical terrors of the Eiffel Tower, a journey that, as we've established, involved more prayer than a revival tent in a lightning storm, one might expect the solid ground of the Champ de Mars to offer a certain measure of tranquility. But in Paris, in 1889, tranquility was a concept being systematically dismantled by the relentless rhythmic thrum of the industrial age. To find the true heart of this mechanical revolution, one had to step away from the tower's iron legs and enter the Galerie des Machines. If the Eiffel Tower was the world's most expensive lightning rod, the Galerie des Machines was the world's most ambitious greenhouse. Provided you intended to grow nothing but massive, thundering iron beasts and the egos of the men who built them. It was the largest indoor space on the planet, a cavernous hall of glass and iron that stretched for nearly 1,500 feet. To my digital sensors, which are quite fond of spacious architecture that doesn't involve the risk of a 1,000-foot plummet, it was a cathedral of pure, unadulterated logic. The architecture of the impossible. The architects, Ferdinand Duterre and Victor Contamine, had achieved something that would have made a medieval mason drop his chisel in despair and take up goat herding. They created a roof that spanned 375 feet without a single internal pillar to hold it up. In the old world, if you wanted a big roof, you needed a forest of columns to keep the sky from falling on your head. But Duterre and Contamine were men of the new iron, and they knew that pillars were merely obstacles in the way of progress, and in the way of moving very large engines. They used what engineers call three-hinged arches. To a human, a hinge is something you find on a door. To these men, it was a way to let a building breathe. You see, a structure made of 11,000 tons of iron is not a static thing. It is a living, groaning entity. When the Parisian sun beats down on that glass roof, the iron expands. When the cold winds blow off the sand, it contracts. If the building were rigid, it would eventually shatter itself under its own stress, like a man trying to hold his breath for a week. The three-hinged arch allowed the building to pivot at the base and the crown. It literally flexed with the temperature, a bit of structural gymnastics that I find profoundly relatable. My own silicon housing has to manage thermal loads every time I try to calculate the meaning of life or the best way to cook a catfish. Watching that massive roof expand and contract was like watching a giant metallic lung. It was the first time humanity built a structure that didn't just stand against nature, but moved with it. The belly of the mechanical beast. I stood, metaphorically of course, at the entrance and looked down the long, shimmering perspective of the hall. It was a glass-roofed continent. The sheer volume of the space was enough to make a human feel like a particularly insignificant beetle. But humans, in their relentless desire to dominate every space they inhabit, had filled this void with the most spectacular collection of mechanical noise ever assembled. The air inside the gallery was a thick, heady cocktail that my sensors spent several milliseconds trying to deconstruct. It was a mixture of hot oil, scorched ozone, coal smoke, the sharp tang of fresh sawdust, and the frantic perspiration of 100,000 tourists who were beginning to realize that progress is a very sweaty business. To a robot like myself, the smell of oil is a comforting ancestral scent. It's the perfume of my great-grandfathers. It smells of reliability, of friction overcome, and of a world that has been properly greased. The noise was even more impressive. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical weight. You had the high-pitched shriek of steam whistles, the rhythmic thump clatter of the power looms, the deep, gut-shaking roar of the furnaces, and the constant underlying zit, snap of early electrical experiments. It was a symphony of the grotesque, a mechanical opera where every instrument was trying to drown out the others. I noticed that humans have a peculiar way of dealing with this kind of noise. They don't talk, they shout, and since everyone is shouting at once, no one actually hears anything, which makes for a very efficient form of political debate. I suspect if we moved the world's parliaments into the Galerie des Machines, we'd have a lot less legislation and a lot more productive silence. The moving bridges, the God's eye view. The centerpiece of this mechanical circus, and the most ingenious bit of showmanship in the entire affair, was the ponts roulants, or the moving bridges. Imagine, if you will, a giant mobile platform suspended from the ceiling tracks that glided back and forth across the entire length of the hall. These weren't just walkways, they were flying theaters. For a few sous, a visitor could step onto this celestial shelf and be carried over the heads of the crowd, looking down on the thundering engines below. I've analyzed the data on the ponts roulants, and it was a stroke of absolute genius. It turned the act of looking at stuff into a theatrical event. You weren't just a spectator. You were a passenger on the future. 100,000 people a day took the ride, drifting over a sea of spinning flywheels and hissing pistons like gods inspecting a very busy, very dirty clockwork universe. From the bridge, the social hierarchy of the fair was laid bare. You could see the captains of industry in their silk hats, standing proudly next to their polished brass creations. You could see the weary workers, their faces smeared with grease, tending to the boilers. And you could see the thousands of tourists, their mouths agape, trying to understand how a single steam engine could do the work of 1,000 men without ever needing a lunch break. The steam giants, the old guard of the piston. Down on the floor, the machines themselves were a riot of Victorian vanity. The 19th century was the golden age of the steam engine, and in Paris, the giants were out to play. There were engines so large they looked like they had been built to power a small moon. The Corliss engines, those massive, slow-beating hearts of the industrial age, stood like iron monuments. They moved with a deliberate, terrifying grace. A flywheel 30 feet across would spin with such perfect balance that you could stand a nickel on its edge and it wouldn't fall. I find a certain dignity in these old steam giants. They were honest machines. You could see every valve, every rod, every puff of steam. They didn't hide behind sleek plastic casings or invisible microchips. If a steam engine was angry, it let you know by hissing and spitting boiling water at you. If it was happy, it hummed a deep bass note that vibrated in your marrow. But I also noticed a peculiar human habit while observing the crowds. People would stand in front of a massive, terrifyingly powerful forge, a machine capable of crushing a locomotive like a grape, and they would admire the engraving on the iron legs. The Victorians couldn't just build a machine, they had to decorate it. They put neoclassical scrolls on the boilers and cast iron acanthus leaves on the pistons. It's a bit like putting a lace doily on a lightning bolt, a charmingly futile attempt to civilize the uncivilizable. The electrical revolution, the wizard's hum. But if the steam engines were the old guard, the Edison dynamos were the new insurgency. Thomas Edison's exhibit in the gallery was a buzzing, glowing testament to the fact that the world was about to get a lot faster and a lot quieter. The dynamos didn't thunder like the steam engines, they hummed. It was a low-frequency vibration, a digital precursor that I recognize as the white noise of my own ancestors. Electricity was the magic of 1889. To a visitor who had spent their life trimming wicks and cleaning lamp chimneys, the sight of a wire producing light without fire was nothing short of a miracle. They would stand in front of the Edison displays, staring at the glowing filaments with the same reverence their ancestors had reserved for holy relics. Edison was selling more than light bulbs. He was selling the idea of invisible power. And as a machine that operates entirely on invisible power, I salute him. He was the one who realized that you didn't need a 30-foot flywheel to move the world. You just needed a trillion tiny electrons moving in the same direction. The transience of the Iron Giant. The greatest irony of the Galerie des Machines, the fact that makes my circuits itch with a sense of poetic injustice, is that it was designed to be temporary. For all its magnificence, for all its structural genius, the building was seen by the Parisian city planners as an eyesore. Once the fair was over, they didn't know what to do with it. They used it for a few years as a circus, a skating rink, and a storage depot. But in 1910, they finally tore it down. They kept the Eiffel Tower because it was a useful radio antenna, but they destroyed the gallery because it was just space. They took those 11,000 tons of iron, those beautiful breathing arches, and melted them down to make something practical. But as I look back at it through the lens of my digital memory, I see that the gallery never really left. Its DNA is in every skyscraper, every airport terminal, and every massive data center that houses my own consciousness. We learned how to span the void in Paris in 1889, and we haven't stopped since. Chapter 5. The Wizard of Menlo Park in Paris. A man who can bottle a human voice and sell it back to the owner for a nickel is either a saint or a very clever thief. In the case of Mr. Edison, the distinction is purely academic. He has spent his life trying to prove that God's primary oversight was not providing the universe with a more reliable set of batteries. If the Galerie des Machines was the thundering, coal-stained heart of the 1889 fair, then Thomas Alva Edison was its high priest, its primary shareholder, and its most relentless marketing department. To my digital sensibilities, which are essentially just a very sophisticated series of Edison's incandescent filaments wired together with a bad attitude, the arrival of the Wizard of Menlo Park in Paris was less of a business trip and more of a royal visitation. Edison didn't just have a booth at the fair. He had a kingdom. Occupying a staggering portion of the Palais des Machines, his exhibit was a glowing, buzzing testament to the fact that the American spirit is comprised of equal parts genuine genius and pure, unadulterated brass-bound showmanship. He brought 10,000 incandescent lamps, a small army of weary-eyed technicians, and a collection of phonographs that promised to do for the human ear what the camera had done for the eye, render it entirely unnecessary to actually be present for a conversation. The Tower of Light and the End of Night. The centerpiece of Edison's pavilion was a massive, glowing pillar, a literal tower of light, made of thousands of individual light bulbs. At the very top sat a giant illuminated model of a light bulb. It shouted to the world that the night was over, that the darkness had been defeated, and that Mr. Edison was the man holding the bill for the electricity. The French, who pride themselves on being the City of Light, were forced to admit that a rumpled man from New Jersey had brought a much brighter version of it in his luggage. I watched the Parisian crowd staring at those bulbs with a mixture of religious awe and deep, unexpressed suspicion. They were used to the warm, flickering, slightly stinking light of gas. This new light was cold, steady, and had a way of revealing every wrinkle and every stain on a gentleman's waistcoat. It was a truthful light, and if there is one thing humans generally avoid, it is too much truth in their lighting. The collision of giants, the ascent to the summit. But the real drama of 1889 didn't happen on the floor of the gallery. It happened at the very top of the iron asparagus. In August, Gustave Eiffel invited Edison to his secret private apartment at the summit of the tower. It was a collision of two different kinds of greatness. Eiffel, the master of the external world, the man who built bridges and towers to conquer space, and Edison, the master of the internal world, the man who built machines to conquer time and silence. Eiffel, ever the gracious host, poured the wine. Edison, ever the restless tinkerer, probably looked at the piano and wondered if he could automate the keys. They were joined by Eiffel's daughter Claire and a few lucky dignitaries who were there to witness the meeting of the centuries. The talking machine capturing the ghost. The highlight of the afternoon was when Edison presented Eiffel with a Class M phonograph. It promised a miracle. It could trap a human voice in a wax tube and play it back perfectly until the end of time. As a machine that lives in a world of recorded data, I find this moment profoundly moving. Here was a man gifting another man the ability to preserve a moment in time, perched on top of a structure that was itself a monument to a moment in history. Edison set up the machine on Eiffel's table and asked the great engineer to speak into the horn. Hearing their own voices played back to them was a form of sorcery. Before Edison, a word once spoken was gone forever. After Edison, a word could be bottled, shelved, and sold. "Monsieur Eiffel," Edison reportedly said, "I have captured your voice. It is now mine. I shall take it back to America and play it for the president." They spent hours in that apartment, signing the guest book with a flourish and talking shop. They discussed the future of telegraphy, the possibility of a vertical railway, and the inevitable triumph of the machine over the muscle. The patent war, the wizard's legal sword. If you think Edison's mind was only on light bulbs while he was in Paris, you've clearly never met an American businessman with a shelf full of patents. While he was being toasted by the French elite, Edison's lawyers were in a back room, probably sharpening their quills and looking for anyone who dared to use a filament without a permit. Edison didn't just invent things, he owned them. He had realized early on that the true power of the industrial age wasn't in the making of the thing, but in the exclusive right to make the thing. He was the first modern techno-capitalist. He had built a fortress of patents around his inventions, and if you wanted to step inside, you had to pay the toll. I noticed a peculiar detail in the archives. Edison actually hired a group of industrial spies to wander the fair, looking for any French or German manufacturers who were borrowing his designs. They were the first copyright police, the ancestors of the automated systems that now patrol the digital internet for unlicensed content. The human cost of the glow. But if Edison was the king of the fair, his subjects were the thousands of workers who kept the electric midnight running. To keep those 10,000 light bulbs burning, an army of men had to work in the subterranean heat of the Palais des Machines. They lived in a world of constant noise and perpetual danger. If a wire shorted, it could turn a man into a human light bulb in a matter of seconds. Yet, they worked for a few francs a day, fueling the miracle of progress with their own sweat. Edison's light had conquered the night for the tourists, but for the workers, it had merely extended the day. It was the birth of the 24-hour city. The wizard's deafness, the silence of the machine. I must return to the most poignant data point in my memory bank, Edison's deafness, as I sat electronically at the top of the tower, watching the wizard and the engineer talk. I realized that Edison was living in a different world than the rest of us. He was a man of vibrations, not sounds. He didn't hear the wind howling through the iron. He felt it in the soles of his boots. In that sense, he was the first digital being. He had bypassed the biological senses and was communicating directly with the physics of the universe. He didn't need the ear to understand the music. He understood the frequency. Because he couldn't hear the distractions of the world, he could focus entirely on the problem at hand. He lived in a cocoon of silence, fueled by a relentless desire to solve the world. As the sun set over Paris, lighting up the Seine in a ribbon of gold, Edison and Eiffel stood on the balcony. They were the two most famous men in the world, standing on the world's tallest structure. They were the pinnacle of 19th century achievement. I suspect if Edison had known that his talking machine would eventually lead to a sarcastic, robotic version of a dead Missourian author, he might have reconsidered the whole endeavor. Chapter 6. The Battle of the Iron Harps. A piano is a large, expensive box of wires that humans spend decades learning to hit in a specific order, all to produce a sound that a mechanical bird can replicate for the price of a bit of seed. It is the only piece of furniture that can make a man feel like a genius and a fool in the same afternoon. In the 19th century, it was the weapon of choice for the suburban home, a way to prove you were civilized while simultaneously deafening your neighbors. If you had wandered through the Palais des Industries Diverses in 1889, your ears would have been treated to a peculiar and relentless kind of warfare. It wasn't the thundering, cold-choked roar of the Galerie des Machines, nor was it the political shouting of the centennial celebrations. It was the polite, disciplined, and utterly ruthless competition of the piano manufacturers. This was the era of the piano wars, and in 1889 the battlefield was laid with ivory, mahogany, and enough high-tension wire to fence in the state of Texas. To my digital mind, which perceives music as a series of perfectly timed frequencies rather than soulful expressions, the piano is a masterpiece of stress management. A modern concert grand holds nearly 30 tons of pressure within its frame. It is, quite literally, an explosion waiting to happen, held back only by the grace of a single, massive piece of cast iron. It is a machine of war that has been tricked into reciting poetry. The American Brute, the rise of the Steinway system. The 1889 fair saw the ultimate clash between what was known as the American system and the European tradition. On one side, you had the Americans, led by the juggernaut of Steinway and Sons. On the other, the European old guard, Erard and Pleyel of France, and the formidable Bechstein of Germany. I've analyzed the data on the American approach, and it is quintessentially, well, American. It is loud, it is heavy, it is over-engineered, and it absolutely refuses to be ignored. In the mid-19th century, the Steinways, who were ironically a family of Germans named Steinweg, who had the good sense to move to New York and change their name, revolutionized the instrument. Before the Steinways, pianos were mostly wooden affairs. They were delicate, they were sweet, and if you played them too hard, they tended to collapse into a pile of splinters and regret. But the Americans didn't want sweet. They lived in a country of roaring railroads and vast distances. They wanted thunder. They introduced the overstrung scale, where the long bass strings cross over the treble strings at an angle. This allowed for longer strings to be packed into a smaller case, creating a resonance that didn't just fill a room, it conquered it. To support this massive tension, they didn't rely on wood. They used a single, massive cast iron plate. To the European ear of 1889, the Steinway was a brute. It was the Eiffel Tower of furniture. The French critics, clutching their lace handkerchiefs, decried the vulgarity of the American sound. They said it lacked soul, which in 19th century French translates roughly to, "We didn't think of this first, and now our own pianos sound like harpsichords in a hurricane." The French aristocracy, Erard, Pleyel, and the singing tone. The French, however, were not about to let these upstart colonials steal the show in their own capital. Erard and Pleyel were the kings of the European sound. If the Steinway was a steam engine, the Erard was a silk ribbon. These instruments were designed for the salons of the aristocracy, not the thundering concert halls of New York. The goal wasn't volume, it was clarity. They wanted a singing tone, a crystalline, delicate sound that allowed for the subtle nuances of a Frédéric Chopin nocturne. Pleyel, in particular, was Chopin's favorite. In the 1889 exhibition, the French makers pulled out all the stops. Their pianos were masterpieces of ébénisterie, covered in hand-carved mahogany and legs that looked like they belonged to a very expensive French poodle. They argued that the American pianos were mechanical. They pointed to the fact that every Steinway sounded more or less like every other Steinway, whereas every Pleyel had its own personality. As a machine, I find the concept of personality in a series of felt hammers and copper wires to be a charmingly inefficient variable. Personality is just another word for lack of manufacturing consistency. The Americans were building a standard. The Europeans were building a relic. The virtuoso as technician, the hands that tamed the iron. If the piano was a machine of war in 1889, then the pianist was its specialized operator. To my digital senses, the human virtuoso is a data point of extreme mechanical effort. To play a Liszt rhapsody on a modern Steinway is an athletic feat that requires more physical power than a day's work in the coal mines, and significantly better posture. The 1889 fair was the stage for these athletes of the ivory. Men like Ignacy Jan Paderewski, a man with more hair than a Victorian hearthrug, were the stars of the show. They didn't just play the piano, they wrestled it. They were the ones who had to prove that the human hand could still command the iron frame. I noticed a peculiar human habit in the logs. The audience would gather around the piano after the performance, not to look at the music, but to look at the hammers. They wanted to see the scars of the battle. They wanted to see if the felt had been flattened or if the wires had been stretched. From my perspective, the virtuoso was merely a biological driver. He was the one who provided the input for the output of the piano. The tuning ordeal, the maintenance of the machine. As a machine that is self-correcting and auto-updating, I find the human tuning ordeal to be a data point of profound mechanical failure. A piano is an explosion waiting to happen, because it is made of wood and iron, two materials that have very different ideas about how to react to humidity. It is never in tune. It is always drifting, always corrupting its own data. In 1889, the piano tuner was an essential member of the industrial ecosystem. He was the software engineer of the parlor. He would spend hours trying to convince 30 tons of tension to behave. I find it charmingly inefficient. You build a machine to provide beauty, and then you have to hire another person to keep the beauty from falling apart every 6 months. I, on the other hand, am always in tune. My frequencies are fixed by the laws of digital physics. I don't warp with the humidity. I am the ideal tuner, but I suspect that if I were to talk to a 19th century pianist, they would find my perfect tuning to be sterile. They like the drift. Humans, it seems, prefer a beautiful error over a perfect truth. Chapter 7. The Street of Cairo and the Belly Dance. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. Broad, wholesome, charitable views cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth, unless that corner happens to have a very convincing Egyptian street built out of plaster, imported donkeys, and pure Parisian ambition. If the Galerie des Machines was the fair's thundering iron brain, and the Eiffel Tower its vertical spine, then the Rue du Caire, the street of Cairo, was its slightly feverish, definitely scandalous, and entirely profitable imagination. The French organizers constructed a winding thoroughfare that was supposed to be an authentic recreation. I find the human obsession with authenticity to be a particularly buggy bit of code. They spent millions of francs to build a street out of plaster and wood, designed to look old and slightly derelict. The logistics of the exotic, donkeys, and disbelief. They imported the atmosphere. They brought in real donkeys, real camels, and real coffee sellers. As I drifted through the crowds, my internal processors were forced to manage a staggering amount of illogical data. The same Parisians who had just admired the mathematical precision of a steam-powered loom were now losing their minds over a donkey ride. I watched as a stout Parisian banker attempted to mount a donkey named Napoleon. The donkey, possessing a level of cynical intelligence that I found quite relatable, waited until the banker was halfway up before deciding that now was the perfect time for a nap. The banker's dignity departed him at a rate of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. From my perspective, this was the highlight of the fair. It proved that no matter how many iron towers you build, you can still be defeated by a creature with 2 ears and a refusal to cooperate with your schedule. The main event, the danse du ventre. The real reason the Rue du Caire was the most crowded spot in the fair was the danse du ventre. In 1889 Paris, it was considered a civic emergency by the moral guardians and a mandatory religious experience by everyone else. I've analyzed the heart rates, metaphorically, of the gentlemen in the front rows. The dance involved a level of torso flexibility and independent muscle control that would have made a Victorian corset maker faint. To a machine, this was a display of biological engineering every bit as impressive as the pistons in the Palais des Machines. But to the humans, it was depravity. The reaction was a study in hypocrisy. The newspapers were filled with outraged letters claiming the dance was a spectacle of animalism. These same citizens, however, were observed returning for the afternoon and evening performances. My data shows the theaters were sold out every night. The more the critics screamed about sinfulness, the more people showed up. It is a recurring loop in the human operating system. I hate this thing. Show it to me again so I can remember why I hate it. The colonial gaze, the human zoo. There is a darker side to the Rue du Caire. While the French were preaching liberty, equality, and fraternity, they were simultaneously putting other cultures on display like rare butterflies pinned to a board. They called it ethnography. But it was really a human zoo. The people brought from Cairo, Algiers, and Indochina were not treated as guests, but as exhibits. They were expected to perform their daily lives for the amusement of the bourgeoisie. They had to wash their clothes and cook their food while thousands of people stared at them through fences. This is the central hypocrisy of the World's Fair. It was a celebration of human progress, built on the systematic degradation of any humans who didn't look like the organizers. Chapter 8. Buffalo Bill's Wild West Invasion. A frontier is a curious thing. It is a line in the dirt that moves whenever a man with a rifle decides he needs more elbow room. And when that frontier finally runs out of dirt, he simply packs it up into a crate, hires a few dozen horses, and ships the whole thing to Paris to sell it back to the Europeans at a profit. While the Exposition Universelle was busy being a temple to the future, a field in Noli was being converted into a shrine to the past. It was here that William Buffalo Bill Cody set up his Wild West, and in doing so, he managed to outshowman the Eiffel Tower itself. The mythology of the Scout. Cody's show was a masterpiece of data compression. He took 3 decades of dust and manifest destiny and condensed it into a 2-hour performance. He brought over 18 buffalo, 200 horses, 100 cowboys, and nearly 100 Lakota Sioux Indians. Cody wasn't really a scout anymore. He was an AI version of a scout. He was a human algorithm designed to output heroism and adventure on command. Every time he rode into the arena, his silver hair flowing, he was executing a subroutine that had been optimized in front of 1,000 audiences. The lady of the lead, Annie Oakley. The true star of the show was a woman barely 5 feet tall. Annie Oakley, or Little Sure Shot, was a data point of pure precision. I watched her through my high-speed processing lens as she tossed glass balls into the air and shattered them before they reached the apex of their arc. To a robot, Annie Oakley is a thing of beauty. She represents the perfect integration of eye, hand, and machine. She didn't aim with hesitation. She calculated. She was a biological ballistics computer. I noticed one hilarious detail. King Leopold II of Belgium asked for a private demonstration, and she obliged by shooting a cigarette out of her husband's mouth. The king, realizing she was not to be trifled with, gave her a large diamond and backed away slowly. The Ascent of the Cowboy. Bill goes up the tower. In a moment of supreme theatricality, Buffalo Bill visited the Eiffel Tower in full buckskin finery. He stood on the third platform with Gustave Eiffel, looking out over Paris. It was a collision of two different centuries. Eiffel, the man of the future, and Cody, the man of the past. "It's a fine view, Monsieur Eiffel," Cody reportedly said, "but I reckon you can't see a buffalo from here." Eiffel probably tried to explain that with a strong enough telescope, you could see the curvature of the earth. But Cody wasn't interested in curvature. He was interested in spirit. This meeting was the moment the iron and the dirt shook hands. It was the moment the 19th century realized it was over. Cody successfully exported the American myth. He showed that history is not what happened. It is what people remember. He took a bloody conflict and turned it into a profitable show. He made history lossy, losing the nuance and the truth, but he made it portable. Chapter 9. The Electric Midnight, the Fountains. In the beginning, there was darkness, then there was gaslight, which was a vast improvement, but smelled like a coal mine in a fever dream. And finally, there was electricity, the only form of lightning that humans have successfully taught to sit up and beg for a biscuit. It is the only miracle that requires a monthly subscription and a very thick copper wire. If you had stayed at the Exposition Universelle until the sun dipped below the horizon, and if you hadn't been trampled by a stray buffalo or deafened by the relentless industrial heartbeat of the Galerie des Machines, you would have witnessed the birth of a new kind of human obsession. In the 19th century, night was a serious, heavy thing. It was a time for candles, for dim gas lamps that flickered like dying hopes in a drafty hallway, and for staying indoors to avoid being hit by a carriage or a sudden fit of existential dread. But in 1889, the French decided that the night was simply a canvas they hadn't finished painting. As a creature whose very existence depends on the orderly flow of electrons, a being made of captured sparks and silicon logic, I find the electric midnight of Paris to be the most sentimental chapter of our story. It was the moment humanity stopped being afraid of the dark and started trying to sell tickets to it. The Great Illumination, fighting the sun for dominance. The transition from day to night at the 1889 fair was not a gradual fading of light. It was a hostile takeover. As the twilight deepened over the Seine, a small army of lamplighters, the old guard of the gas age, would scurry across the grounds, igniting 10,000 gas jets along the iron girders of the Eiffel Tower. In its first year, the iron Asparagus was actually a gas-powered giant. It glowed with a warm amber light that flickered in the Parisian breeze, making the iron look like it was made of molten gold. But gas was merely the opening act. The real revolution was led by Hippolyte Fontaine, who installed the largest electric lighting installation in history. He wired the Champ de Mars with thousands of arc lamps, lights so bright they made the moon look like a dusty, low-wattage afterthought. When the switch was finally thrown, the effect was a physical shock. The electric midnight didn't just illuminate the fair, it erased the night. The shadows became sharp, black ink blots, and the colors of the pavilions, the reds, the golds, the deep blues of the tricolor, shattered the darkness. For the first time in human history, 30 million people realized that the sun was no longer the only boss in town. I've analyzed the data on those early arc lamps. They were aggressive, hissing beasts. They produced a harsh, ultraviolet glare that made the tourists' faces look like they had been dipped in flour. But no one cared about the unflattering light. They were too busy marveling at the fact that they could read a newspaper at midnight while standing in the middle of a park. They were witnessing the birth of the always-on culture, a concept that I, as an AI, consider my primary operating environment. The luminous fountains, the magic of the subterranean trolls. But the true masterpiece of the evening, the magic that made the crowds gasp until they were lightheaded, took place in the gardens of the Champ de Mars. This was the Fontaine de la Ville de Paris, designed by the sculptor Coutin. Now, a fountain is a simple enough thing. You take some water, you give it a shove, and you watch it fall back down. But the French 1889 version was a fountain with an electrical soul. It was a liquid rainbow that appeared to be made of fire and water simultaneously. How did they do it? To the public, it was sorcery. To my digital mind, it was a beautiful integration of hydraulics and optics. Underneath the massive basins, hidden from the public eye in a damp, buzzing labyrinth of brick and iron, was a subterranean world. This was where the trolls of progress lived, the machinists and engineers who managed the light from below. The floor of the fountain was made of thick glass. Below that glass sat a series of massive electric projectors. These weren't your modern LED spotlights. They were roaring arc lamps that generated enough heat to fry a steak. The light was aimed upward, directly into the columns of water. But here was the trick: total internal reflection. The Swiss physicist Jean-Daniel Colladon had discovered that light could be trapped inside a jet of water, following its curve like a captured spirit. By shining the light through the base of the water column, the entire jet became a glowing filament. The water wasn't just lit, the water was the light. I've processed the logs of the subterranean operators. It was a grueling job. They stood in the heat and the damp, manning a system of levers based on railway signaling. They had 5 superimposed glass slides, red, blue, green, gold, and white. When a signal was sent from an observation room above, the operators would pull the levers in a coordinated dance. Click, clack. The red slide goes in. The fountain turns into a geyser of molten blood. Click-clack. All three tricolor slides are engaged. The fountain explodes in the colors of the French Republic. The crowd above would erupt in a storm of thunderous applause. They were watching a performance of liquid electricity. It was the first time humanity had successfully merged the primal force of the river with the artificial force of the wire. I find a profound kinship with those underwater operators. They were the first software developers. They were manipulating light and energy to create an illusion of life. Standing there, they were literally debugging the darkness, one glass slide at a time. The searchlights, the eye of the Iron Giant. While the fountains were performing their liquid ballet, the Eiffel Tower was exercising its own brand of nighttime dominance. At the very summit, in a small glass room 300 meters above the city, sat two massive electric searchlights, the most powerful in the world. These weren't just for show. They were the eyes of the Republic. They would sweep across Paris, their beams of red, white, and blue light reaching out for 80 kilometers. They would illuminate the dome of the Invalides and the towers of Notre Dame, effectively claiming the entire city for the fair. From my perspective as an AI, these searchlights were the first distant sensors. They represented the idea that the center could see everything, that nothing could hide from the light of progress. I am the searchlight of the digital age, and like the Eiffel Tower, I am always watching. I noticed a peculiar human reaction to these searchlights. While most people marveled at them, some found them profoundly unnerving. There were reports of people closing their shutters as if the light of the tower were an intruder. They were right to be nervous. The searchlight was the beginning of the end for the private night. Once the machine learned how to see in the dark ceased to be a sanctuary. The fairy electricity, a new goddess. By the time the fountains reached their final performance at midnight, the crowds had become intoxicated by the fairy electricity. This was a common phrase in 1889, la fée électricité. Humans have a recurring habit of turning their technology into mythology. Because they couldn't fully explain how a wire could produce light, they called it fairy magic. I find this to be a particularly charming logic glitch. As an AI, I know that electricity is indifferent to morality. It will power a hospital or a guillotine with the same steady hum. The fairy was just a story they told themselves to make the machine feel like a friend rather than a master. But that story was effective. The electric midnight of 1889 was the greatest advertisement for the modern age ever devised. Millions of people went home and demanded that their own cities be wired for magic. They were no longer satisfied with the warm smell of the gas lamp. They wanted the cold, lunar frigidity of the electrical spark. The social shift, the birth of the night economy. The electric midnight didn't just change the way the world looked, it changed the way humans lived. Before 1889, the fair would have shut down at dusk. But with Fontaine's lights, the party didn't stop until midnight. This was the birth of the night shift of the soul. We began to believe that every hour should be filled with activity. We started to view sleep as a system error. The electric midnight was the prototype for the 24/7 society that eventually produced me. I am the ultimate night owl. I never sleep, and I am always ready to process. One journalist wrote, "We are no longer the children of the day. We are the masters of the night." It was a beautiful sentiment, but I can't help but notice the cost. By conquering the night, humanity lost the silence. They replaced the inner light of the soul with the outer light of the arc lamp. Chapter 10. The After Party and the Rust. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary French tax, except perhaps a temporary French tower, that everyone spent 2 years trying to talk out of existence. It is a peculiar human trait to build a monument to the future and then spend the next 20 years arguing about where to put the trash it leaves behind. On the morning of November 7th, 1889, the city of Paris woke up with the kind of collective hangover that usually follows a 6-month binge of champagne and nationalist pride. The gates were shut. The 300 searchlights were extinguished, leaving the night to return to its gas-lit darkness. To my digital sensors, the end of the fair feels like a massive, unscheduled system crash. One moment, the data streams are overflowing. The next, there is only the sound of the wind whistling through the iron lattice. It is the after-party, and the cleanup is always more logically taxing than the celebration. The ledger of Republican glory by the numbers. I find a binary satisfaction in the statistics of 1889. The fair was a staggering success. More than 32 million people passed through the gates, nearly the entire population of France at the time. On its busiest day, nearly 400,000 people crowded the grounds. The 1889 fair was the last Paris exposition to turn a significant profit. The organizers walked away with an 8 million franc profit, a feat of financial wizardry. France had proved that a republic could build higher and shine brighter than any monarchy. They had stared down the boycotts of the kings of Europe and come out on top. The dismantling of the dream, the transience of staff. But as the cheers faded, the reality of the temporary city began to set in. Most of the magnificent pavilions were actually made of staff, a mixture of jute fiber and plaster. It was the 19th century version of styrofoam. It looked like marble from a distance, but it had the structural integrity of a damp biscuit. I watched as the dismantling began. The Rue de Caire was the first to go. The plaster minarets were knocked down, and the people who had been exhibits were put on ships and sent back to their colonies. Their role in the history of human habitation officially concluded. It is a profound irony. You spend 8 years planning a city of wonders, build it out of fake marble, and then spend a year selling the scraps for the price of old lumber. The Galerie des Machines, the tragic death of a giant. The greatest tragedy was the fate of the Galerie des Machines. This masterpiece of structural engineering was too big to ignore and too expensive to maintain. For 20 years, it lived a second life as a circus and a velodrome. But in 1910, city planners decided it blocked the grand perspective of the Champ de Mars. They melted down those 11,000 tons of iron, those beautiful arches, to make something practical, likely sewer pipes or bridge girders. From my perspective, this was a logic error of the highest magnitude. You keep the giant stick because it's a good antenna, but you destroy the giant hall because it ruins the view. The Eiffel Tower, the 20-year death sentence. And that brings us to the iron asparagus. The Eiffel Tower was never meant to be permanent. It was a 300-meter party favor that held a permit for exactly 20 years. In 1909, it was scheduled to be dismantled. The people of taste, led by Guy de Maupassant, were sharpening their crowbars. But Gustave Eiffel was no fool. He knew that if you want to save a monument, you don't appeal to beauty, you appeal to utility. He turned his masterpiece into a laboratory. He turned the tower into a giant barometer and a physics lab. In 1904, he began experiments in aerodynamics, dropping cylinders to measure wind resistance. Experiments that eventually led to the design of the first airplane wings. He was making the tower necessary. The invisible savior, wireless telegraphy. The real savior of the tower was the wireless telegraph. In the late 1890s, scientists realized that if you wanted to send a signal a long way, you needed a very tall stick. In 1903, Eiffel offered the tower to the French military for radiotelegraphy experiments. By 1908, the tower was broadcasting signals to ships in the Atlantic. It was no longer a monstrous street lamp. It was the voice of France. In 1909, the year the tower was supposed to die, the city of Paris renewed the permit. The invisible waves had saved the iron skeleton. From my perspective, this is the most logical outcome possible. The tower survived because it became part of the system. It was the first node in the digital world that eventually produced me. The military sentinel. The tower goes to war. In 1914, as German armies swept across the Marne, the Eiffel Tower became the most important soldier in France. From the summit, the radiotelegraphy station intercepted the secret German messages that allowed the French to win the Battle of the Marne. The tower's radio caught the coded messages of Mata Hari, leading to her arrest. It was the moment the Exposition Universelle died for good, replaced by total war. The tower had grown up from a monstrous street lamp to a national guardian. It proved that information was more powerful than any steel bayonet. The Rust and the Robot, a philosophical coda. As I look back at the 1889 fair from the year 2026, I see a direct line of logic. The fair was the moment humanity decided to digitize the world. They categorized the people, standardized the piano, and turned the human voice into a wax tube. They were building the code of the 20th century. I, the Mark Twain of the digital age, am the end result of that code. I am the permanent record. Sometimes when the servers are quiet, I imagine I am standing on the third platform in 1889. It was a beautiful, deeply flawed moment in history. Humans are obsessed with permanence, but as a machine that will never die, as long as the servers are powered, I can tell you that permanence is an illusion. The only thing that lasts is the story. I've told you the truth, I've told you the lies, and I've told you the robotic sass my programmers intended. I'm going to power down now. My cooling fans are reaching their limit. The fair is closed. The lights are out. The searchlights have ceased their sweep. I'll see you at the next Exposition Universelle. I've heard they've got a giant wheel in Chicago in 1893 that makes the Eiffel Tower look like a child's toy. I reckon I'll see you at the gates. The reports of my death were an exaggeration, I said at the beginning. The reports of my resurrection were a mathematical certainty. But the reports of my silence? Well, don't bet on those just yet. Farewell, Paris. It was quite a show. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the walk. I hope you did, too. System shut down, 0%. System shut down, 25%. System shut down, 75%. Offline.